Welcome to our council tax webinar. I'm Tom Barrett. I'm an area services manager at the Charity for Civil Servants. My primary focus here at the charity is to develop and deliver services relating to issues around debt and finance. I've worked in the debt and money advice sector for around 10 years at a variety of organisations, including a housing association, law centre and a national telephone advice provider. So the charity's vision is a lifelong community of people offering effective support for each other when life takes a turn for the worse. All civil servants, whether they're current, former or retired, are a part of our lifelong community. And this means that if somebody leaves the civil service, then they are still eligible to come to us for help. The dependents of civil servants and former civil servants are also eligible as well. By dependents, we mean those people that are financially dependent on the person who was or is a civil servant. Although the charity is funded by civil servants, you don't actually need to have donated to the charity in the past to apply for help. There's no membership as such. By being or having been a civil servant, you're already part of our community. So what we'll cover, we're going to cover a bit about what is council tax, who does and doesn't pay a council tax, how you pay it, whether you have to pay council tax and what happens if you don't, possible assistance schemes if you can't afford to pay your council tax, how council tax is recovered if you don't pay it, how to deal with council tax arrears if it gets to that stage. The webinar doesn't cover second properties and holiday homes. It's the separate rules for these types of properties, and also doesn't cover business rates, although as this is a separate tax, although in some ways similar to council tax. So what is council tax? Council tax is essentially a land tax with personal elements included. It was introduced in 1992 as a replacement for the much hated poll tax. The amount that you have to pay is based purely on the 1991 value of your property. However, valuations were often not completed accurately and were done on a drive-by basis from a car quite often. For properties built since then, councils essentially guess what a property might have been worth in 1991 had it been built back then. The system has remained largely unchanged since 1992, and many people believe that it should be reformed. One issue being that the value of many properties has increased substantially since 1991 in some areas, such as London, while in other areas, such as, for example, the North East, increases in value have only been moderate. Some people argue because of this that the tax is therefore regressive, meaning that wealthy people pay proportionally much less of their income than much less well-off people. At the current time, however, given the issues, political issues, Brexit obviously being one of them, and its consumption of parliamentary time, there's little likelihood that council tax will be reformed in the near future. So we need to deal with it as it is. So who pays council tax? So legally, a person may have liability to pay council tax at their sole or main residence. The majority of adults have some liability to pay council tax. This includes people on what are often called subsistence benefits, such as job seekers allowance or the universal credit equivalent. Although the amount that they're asked to pay will be much less than somebody not on those benefits, generally somebody on subsistence benefits would be paying in the region of 10 to 20% of the total council tax bill, but this will depend on your local authority area. Prior to 2013, people on such low incomes, prior to April 2013 in fact, people on such low incomes were eligible for something called council tax benefit. Unfortunately, this has now been abolished and each council operates their own reduction scheme, which we'll come on to further on in the webinar. So who doesn't pay council tax? Full-time students don't pay council tax. They're essentially invisible for council tax purposes. So this means that, for example, if two adults live in a property together, one works full-time and the other is a student, the employed person is classed as a single occupant for council tax purposes, and therefore they would be entitled to a 25% discount. If On the other hand, the property were inhabited or inhabited by solely by students, then there'd be no council tax due on that property. If, however, the property were inhabited by 2 adults employed full-time and 1 student, then there would still be 100% of the council tax due. A property solely inhabited by a group of people in that list, as with students, would pay no council tax at all. If you have left your property empty and it's no longer your main residence because you're providing personal care due to somebody's old age, disablement, illness, alcohol or drug dependence, or mental illness, then you may not have to pay council tax at all as well. You'll need to provide evidence to the council to prove that you're in one of the groups that are listed there. What I would say is the list isn't exhaustive, and there may be other exempt groups, but these are the groups that are possibly most relevant to this audience. So it may be worthwhile contacting your local council if you think you might be entitled to a discount or shouldn't be paying council tax. At the bottom there, sitting on its own, are homes in multiple occupation. If you live in a property that's a HMO, where you don't have exclusive use of facilities such as the kitchen, bathroom, those kind of things, then it would be the landlord that would be liable for the council tax, although often the landlord will factor in the council tax into your rent. HMOs, if you've not come across them, are more commonly known as house shares. So, question, does council tax have to be paid? In short, it does. If you're liable to pay council tax, then generally you're not going to get out of it. There's many opinions, largely on the internet, on quasi-legal opinion that council tax isn't enforceable. I've come across numerous people who go before a magistrate with such arguments, only for them to fail, with the outcome being that the debt's now increased due to court costs. And such insistence that you will not pay council tax could actually be considered as willful refusal, which in England could lead to you being sent to prison. Such arguments that you don't have to pay council tax relate to things such as being a freeman of the land, based on some tenuous link to the Magna Carta. Legal opinion on these is that there's no legal basis to them at all, and it's essentially nonsense. There are legitimate arguments against the current council tax system on a sound legal basis, and some of these are being addressed by suitably qualified legal professionals, but they're outside of the scope of this webinar, really. So how council tax is paid. So council tax can be paid via a variety of methods. Standing order, direct debit are the best for organisational purposes. They're automated, obviously provided the money is available, payment should be made. If paying by standing order or direct debit, you need to be aware that some councils don't automatically reinstate your direct debit or reinstate your direct debit rather, and you'll likely need to set it up again in the next year, and equally with standing orders, if you've only set them up for a set monthly period, then you'll need to reinstate those with your bank as well. Councils will normally ask for payment across 10 months, but financially, if you want to spread the burden a little bit, you can ask them to spread it over 12, which might make it a little bit easier. And if you're fortunate enough to have a lump sum of cash, then you can also pay your council tax in one go, and some councils will offer a discount for large one-off payments. So how should council tax be prioritised? On the whole, debts drop into 2 categories, priority and non-priority. Initially, when you get your council tax bill, it's not a debt as such, it's a priority payment. It really only becomes a debt once arrears accrue, at which point it is a priority debt. And the reason that it's a priority debt is that the sanctions for not paying it can be severe, and they'll always be much more severe than the sanctions imposed for not paying what we term as a non-priority creditor. When deciding if a debt is a priority or a non-priority, you need to consider what the creditor can do. If a creditor can't take you home, send you to prison, cut off vital services, then it's unlikely that they're going to be a priority. Some priority debts, in addition to council tax, would include things like your rent, your mortgage, TV license or gas or electric. And non-priority debts might include things like your credit cards, unsecured loans. Some sanctions imposed by these types of creditors are far less severe. The examples of priority and non-priority debts there isn't, again, exhaustive. So if you're not sure about a particular debt, then you should seek advice on what to do about it and how to deal with it. So in some scenarios we come across people simply can't afford the council tax. So this slide looks at what we can do about that and what options that you've got. So firstly, as we mentioned previously, councils now administer their own council tax support scheme, sometimes called council tax reduction. So you might want to contact your council to see if you're entitled to any of that support, and that could significantly reduce your bill. It must as well be said, it sits separately to universal credit. So some people think it is included in universal credit, but it's not. So if you're in receipt of universal credit, then you'll need to apply for it separately. In addition to council tax support, some councils have discretionary hardship schemes. This is essentially a pot of cash, a fund set aside to help those in greatest need pay their council tax, and it's completely separate to the council tax support scheme, so you could get both. Not all councils run these schemes, however, unfortunately. You could apply for a discretionary housing payment as well. Again, these are administered by your local council and they differ from one council to another. A discretionary housing payment is a payment on top of your housing benefit, so it'll help you with housing costs, so not directly with council tax, but a successful application for a discretionary housing payment could allow you a bit of room in order to pay your council tax. Excuse me. It may also be worth carrying out a benefit check as well via Turn to Us. Every year, millions of pounds of support goes unclaimed. The Turn to Us search function will search for normal income-related benefits as well as council tax support. So obviously a successful claim for one of these might make it easy to pay your council tax. And some of those benefits as well have passporting effects, so it could actually mean that you become eligible for things like free prescriptions, eye tests or school dinners, again easing your budget possibly to help you pay your council tax. If you're living in a property where adaptations have been made to your home for the purposes of a disability, for example you've got a wet room installed, then you might be eligible to have your council tax reduced by one band, so reduce the amount that you've got to pay. Again, as well, you could also check that your property is in the right band, because as we said at the beginning, properties were valued generally from a car in 1991, so you might be in the wrong band. So that could actually reduce the amount that you've got to pay. Equally as well, unfortunately, what you do need to be aware of with that is it can put your council tax up and also put the council tax up for your neighbours as well, so you need to be aware of that. And finally, you could make a request to your council to have your liability for council tax reduced, and this can be reduced down to as low as 0. This is a power that councils have via Section 13A of the Local Government and Finance Act, which we'll come on to on the next slide. So Section 13A of the Local Government and Finance Act, often called the best kept secret in council tax. People often confuse this power that councils have with council tax support and previously with council tax benefit as well. Anybody can apply for a Section 13A reduction. You don't have to be in receipt of any benefits or eligible for the council's reduction scheme. Applications are always made on the basis of hardship, so even if you're in work, you don't get any benefits. If you can't afford your council tax, you can apply, although it's likely that the council are going to want to see some evidence of your hardship, such as bank statements, wage slips, sick notes, utility bills, those kind of things. And when making your application, it's probably best to stick all that in at the beginning to save time, really. There's no specified format for making a request, a Section 13A request, although a letter or email would be better, as these can easily be kept and used as evidence of your request. But your request must be specific and must state that you're requesting a reduction under Section 13A of the Local Government and Finance Act 1992. If you're not successful in your request, which unfortunately people often aren't in the first instance, and the council reject your application, it's not the end. You can ask that or you can refer your application on to the valuation tribunal for a decision. And England and Wales have a separate valuation tribunal. In a recent case, the valuation tribunal considered the case of a woman who was employed, not eligible for council tax support, and had exhausted her debt relief options, but due to illness couldn't afford a full council tax. She was successful, and her liability was reduced to zero. So it's useful to bear that in mind. Valuation tribunals are published. Tribunal decisions are published, so it may be worthwhile looking through them to see if there are any with scenarios similar to yours. If there are, refer to them in your original request to the council, as doing so can be persuasive, and it also shows that you know what you're talking about. And a link is on that slide there to the recent valuation tribunal case that we referred to. So what happens if council tax isn't paid? So you'll receive various reminders from the council asking you to pay your council tax, and eventually they'll withdraw your right to pay by instalments, and the whole year will become due in one payment. However, at this stage, it's still not too late to negotiate a payment agreement. How to make agreements will be covered further on. If no agreement is reached, the council will eventually apply to the Magistrates' Court for a liability order. Now, the Magistrates' Court is a criminal court. However, this does remain a civil matter, and you won't receive a criminal record if this does happen. The liability order, however, allows the council to then enforce the debt, and enforcement takes many forms. The two that are most commonly used and the ones that you're most likely to come across are the use of enforcement agents, firstly, formerly known as bailiffs and still commonly known as bailiffs, or the council may ask your employer to deduct money from your wages, which can make things quite difficult because it's a high percentage of your gross wage. In more extreme cases, the council could actually make you bankrupt. So if you owe them more than £5,000, you could actually potentially risk losing your property through bankruptcy if you own one, or they could actually ask that the debt be secured against your property as well by way of something called a charging order. Potentially as well, the council may consider pursuing a county court judgment for the money, or a CCJ, which would be recorded on your credit file, and this would affect your credit rating if this happened. In England, unfortunately, people can still be sent to prison, only in specific circumstances though. So if you refuse to pay or you neglect to pay, so you spend your money on something else when you should be paying your council tax. In Wales now, imprisonment has stopped, fortunately. It is rare, but it does happen, so you just need to be aware of that as well. If you do receive anything that states that committal proceedings, so means that the council are preparing to send you to prison, are to commence, then obviously we'd recommend that you seek advice pretty quickly. So the next slide is looking at enforcement. So in some cases, when people come to us, their council tax has already been enforced, so they've gone through the steps that we've previously discussed there. Just because enforcement has begun doesn't mean that you shouldn't make an offer. Enforcement action can be stopped at any time, and again, further on in the webinar, we'll look at how to make offers. It's important to remember your rights if your debt is with an enforcement agent. They can't break in or force entry, and therefore you should keep your doors locked, and if you've got a car, ensure that they don't know which car is yours. A council can apply to deduct up to 2 debts from your wage. This could potentially be a high proportion of your gross wage, so it could potentially be in the region of 34% for 2 deductions, quite a lot of money. If that is happening and such deductions are causing financial hardship, then you need to tell the council this, and again, you need to send them evidence to prove that it's causing hardship as well. In some households, people might be vulnerable. If this is the case, again, tell the council. They should have a vulnerability policy, and it should influence on how they choose to enforce the debt. They shouldn't be sending it to bailiffs and things like that, for example. Perhaps depends on their individual policies. If you've received anything stating that you're about to be made bankrupt, or the debt is to be secured on your property by a charging order, then again, seek advice on those ones immediately. At the end of the slide, we'll look at where you can get advice. Sorry, at the end of the webinar, where you can get advice from. So making an agreement to pay. So it's important that firstly that any agreement that you make to pay your council tax is affordable. Don't make unaffordable agreements. Making unaffordable agreements will normally mean that other bills go unpaid, and will simply mean that the problem gets pushed into other areas of your finances, potentially creating problems with other bills such as your rent or your utilities. Even if you can only offer small amounts of money, you should do so. Remember, you can't pay money that you don't have. Bear in mind that your council tax is a priority, however, and the council will expect that you're paying your council tax over non-priority payments such as unsecured loans, credit cards or catalogues, for example. If prioritising in this way means that you're going to struggle to pay your other bills, then it's probable that you're going to need some debt advice. And again, sources of debt advice and money advice will be given at the end of the webinar. What you should always remember when making an agreement is that the debt's always the council's. So even if it's with an enforcement agent, you can make your offer to the council directly. You don't have to negotiate with the enforcement agent if you don't want to. If the council tells you that they can't accept your offer, this is incorrect, and you should look at making a complaint. And there'll be some info on complaints coming up as well. So moving on, or carrying on rather, with making an agreement to pay. So often what you might come up against is that the council's collections department say they can't accept an offer, or that they need the arrears to be cleared within the council tax year. There's absolutely nothing in law that states that this has to be the case. And in fact, there's guidance that says it doesn't have to be the case. So most councils are signed up to something called the council tax collection of council tax arrears good practice protocol, which states that agreements to pay arrears must be affordable and sustainable. So if that means you can only pay what you can afford, then they need to be considering that guidance. When you make an offer, you should always send a financial statement, as this justifies your income, or it shows you income and expenditure and justifies why you're making the offer that you are. As soon as you've made your offer of payment, start making the payment straight away, regardless of whether the council have accepted. This shows good intent and that you're committed to your offer. You can normally make your payment via bank transfer, often by card on the council's website, or standing order. Via these methods, the council doesn't have to set up any acceptance or institute anything to allow you to pay. So complaints, which we mentioned a couple of slides back about making a complaint. If you're dissatisfied in any way with the council or the council's enforcement agents, the council's enforcement agents' conduct in particular, then you should make a complaint. The enforcement agent is appointed by the council as their representative, so they're responsible. So the council are responsible for their conduct. In the first instance, you should complain to the council. This can be done via the post, electronically, or even verbally, but it's better to do it in a written format. So a letter or an email, as you're able to keep a copy of this. And if you do need to escalate it, it acts as proof that the complaint has been lodged. When you receive your response back from the council about your complaint, if you're not satisfied with this, then you can refer it onto the local government and social care ombudsman for a final decision. This can also be done if the council haven't responded within 8 weeks of you lodging your complaint. Complaints about enforcement agents in particular need to be directed to the council, not to Civia, as previously was the case. So that was their bailiffs industry body, who no longer field complaints when the bailiff is acting on behalf of the council. In complaint cases, it can also be useful to copy in your local MP or councillor and ask that they intervene too. And some people have also previously referred their stories to the local media, as councils and enforcement companies will often want to avoid any negative publicity. So if you are having council tax problems or debt problems more broadly, The Charity for Civil Servants has its own money advice service. The Charities service is regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, and all the charities advisors hold the certificate in money advice practice from the Institute of Money Advisors as well. If you'd like to speak to an advisor, then you need to complete our application process, and you can do this online via the link there, or there is a telephone number to request a paper form if you need one of those. Alternatively, if you'd rather seek advice elsewhere, then there's a number of organisations that you can do so. National Deadline, Step Change and Pay Plan are all national advice providers, as are Citizens Advice, but you can go to Citizens Advice for face-to-face advice. And many employers also have employee assistance programs as well, who can often provide debt and money advice too. And just finally, as well as debt and money advice, we provide various other services as well, all of which are listed on our website via the link there. So you can have a look at that and see if there's anything else that may be of use or interest. So that's the end of our webinar. So thanks very much for joining.